that everyone around you secretly resents. Not because you did anything wrong to them. Not because you failed at anything. But because at some point you stopped explaining yourself, and silence is the one thing people cannot argue with. Somewhere in the last few years you may have noticed a strange shift happening in your own life. The moment you stopped announcing your plans out loud, the moment you stopped defending every choice you made, the moment you simply went quiet and let your actions speak instead of your voice, people around you started reacting differently. Some got confused. Some got uncomfortable. A few got outright hostile. And if you paid close attention, you probably noticed something interesting underneath all of that reaction. It wasn't really about you. It was about what your silence exposed in them. This is not a video about becoming cold, distant, or pretending you don't care about the people in your life. This is a video about something the old Stoic philosophers understood almost 2,000 years ago, something modern psychology and neuroscience are only now catching up to and confirming with actual data. The fastest way to drain your finite life is to spend it explaining that life to people who were never going to understand it anyway, and were never entitled to an explanation in the first place. By the time this ends, you will understand exactly why the quietest person in any room is usually the most dangerous one to underestimate, why growth that gets announced early rarely survives contact with other people's opinions, and why a man who ruled an empire stretching across 3 continents, with more raw power than almost anyone in recorded history, sat down every single night and wrote himself a private reminder to stop caring what people thought of him. If the most powerful human being on earth had to fight that battle daily, it should tell you something about how universal, and how stubborn, this pull towards seeking approval really is. Marcus Aurelius commanded legions. He held authority that could end a person's entire life with a single word. He had access to every luxury, every form of validation, every kind of praise a human being could want. And yet, in his private journal, a collection of notes, he never once intended for anyone else's eyes, he kept circling back to the same quiet obsession. Not conquest. Not legacy. Not even virtue described in some abstract, philosophical way. He kept reminding himself, night after night, to stop wasting his limited hours imagining what other people were whispering about him behind closed doors. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath that habit of his: your brain was never designed for peace. It was designed for social survival. For the overwhelming majority of human history, being talked about badly by your tribe could mean the difference between protection and exile, between having food tomorrow and starving alone. So even now, in a world where none of that applies the way it used to, your nervous system still reacts to gossip, to judgment, to being misunderstood, as though it were a genuine threat to your survival. That is precisely why one negative comment can sit heavy in your chest for hours, replaying on a loop, while 10 compliments from the same day disappear from memory almost instantly. That reaction is not a personal weakness. It is old biology, doing exactly what it was built to do, in a world that no longer exists in the way it once did. But here is where the Stoics made a discovery that still holds up under every modern study on anxiety, self-worth, and burnout. You cannot control what people say about you, you cannot control how they interpret your choices, and you cannot control the story they build about your life in their own heads. What you do have complete control over is how much of your irreplaceable life you hand over to managing that story. Every minute spent crafting the perfect response to a critic is a minute that will never return to you. Every hour spent lying awake wondering if you were too much, too quiet, too ambitious, too slow, too different, is an hour subtracted permanently from the only currency that has ever actually mattered, your attention, spent instead on becoming who you're actually capable of becoming. If you've ever genuinely tried to mind your own business, truly stopped explaining, stopped defending, stopped performing your progress in front of an audience, you already know this doesn't feel peaceful in the beginning. It feels like exposure. It feels like walking through the world without your usual armor. That discomfort has a name in modern psychology. It's called the need for external validation, and it is one of the most deeply wired patterns in the human mind, planted early and reinforced for years without you ever choosing it consciously. From childhood, most people are taught, without anyone meaning any harm by it, that being good means being seen being good. Grades were read out loud. Achievements were praised in front of a room. Attention became the reward for performance, again and again, until it quietly became a need instead of a preference. So by the time you're an adult, some deep part of you genuinely believes that if no one is watching your growth happen, it might not fully count as real. This is the exact trap that keeps talented, capable people small for years longer than necessary. They cannot simply build something. They feel a pull to narrate the building. They cannot simply heal from something painful. They feel a pull to document the healing publicly. And the moment growth becomes a performance stage for an audience, it quietly stops being growth at all and starts becoming theater, shaped not by what actually serves the person doing it, but by whatever will get the strongest reaction from whoever happens to be watching. Epictetus, a man who spent part of his early life enslaved before becoming one of the most respected teachers in the ancient world, described this in a way that modern self-help culture has softened into something almost forgettable, but the original idea is still brutally honest and still completely true today. Some things in life are within your power. Some things are not. Your reputation is not within your power. Other people's opinions of your choices are not within your power. Even your own body, your circumstances, and your final outcomes are only partially within your power. What remains fully within your power, every single day, is your judgment, your effort, your discipline, and your response to whatever happens to you. The moment you stop pouring energy into the things you cannot control and pour everything instead into the things you can, something inside you genuinely shifts. You stop needing an audience for your discipline. You stop needing applause to validate your patience. You start building a version of yourself that exists whether or not anyone is watching, and that version, quietly, is the only one strong enough to survive real pressure when it eventually arrives. Now let's bring this same idea fully into today, into this current era, because the ancient problem wears a very modern disguise now. You are not just surrounded by a small village, judging your choices over a fence the way people were centuries ago. You are surrounded by an audience with no edges, no closing hours, available to judge you at any hour of the day through a screen sitting in your own pocket. Every choice you make, your career pivot, your workout routine, your relationship decisions, even your silence itself, can be witnessed, dissected, and judged by strangers who will never face a single real consequence connected to your actual life. This creates a very specific, very modern kind of exhaustion that simply didn't exist during Marcus Aurelius's lifetime, but his same ancient solution still works perfectly against it: the discipline of internal validation. This is not arrogance. It is not indifference to feedback that genuinely matters and comes from people who've earned the right to give it. It is a settled, quiet confidence that no longer needs a comment section, a like count, or a group chat's approval to confirm that what you're doing is real and worthwhile. Here's a pattern worth noticing honestly in your own life if you haven't already. The people who talk the most about their goals before they've actually achieved anything are very often the same people who never finish what they started. Not because they lack ability or intelligence, but because the act of talking about the plan releases almost the exact same reward chemistry in the brain that actually finishing the plan would have released. Announcing the goal out loud felt so close to accomplishing the goal that real motivation quietly leaked out of the body before the actual, difficult work ever even started. This is a documented pattern in behavioral psychology today, and the Stoics essentially discovered the same truth 2,000 years earlier, purely through patient observation of human nature around them. Growth that gets announced too early tends to get diluted by the applause it receives. Growth that stays private stays hungry, focused, and far more likely to actually reach completion. So if you've been feeling a quiet pull lately to stop posting the process, stop explaining your pivot to people who never asked for the details, stop justifying a decision to family members who are never going to fully support it anyway, that pull is not laziness, and it's not you being secretive or difficult. That is your own inner wisdom trying to protect the one resource you can never buy back once it's spent, your focused, undiluted energy, aimed at your own becoming instead of at everyone else's approval. Now, an important distinction, because plenty of people misunderstand this idea and end up isolated instead of genuinely empowered by it. Minding your own business does not mean disappearing from the relationships that actually matter in your life. It does not mean refusing to communicate with people who genuinely deserve honesty from you, a partner, a close friend, a business partner who is directly affected by the choices you're making. Silence used purely as avoidance is not Stoicism at all. It is fear, simply wearing a philosophical costume to look more respectable. The Stoics were never hermits hiding from the world. Marcus Aurelius ruled in full public view every single day of his reign. Seneca advised one of the most unpredictable, dangerous emperors in Roman history through real, face-to-face conversations that carried real consequences. Their discipline was never about hiding from other people. It was about becoming unshaken by the opinions of people who had no genuine stake in their life, while remaining fully present, fully honest, and fully available to the small number of people who did. So the real question worth asking yourself is never, who should I stop talking to entirely? The real question is, who actually has a legitimate claim on an explanation from me, and who is simply demanding an opinion they never actually earned the right to have? Your landlord does not need to understand why you're saving aggressively this year. Distant relatives do not need to approve of your career change before you're allowed to make it happen. Old classmates from a decade ago do not get a vote on whether your new direction in life makes sense to them. But your spouse, your closest friend, your business partner, the people who genuinely share consequences with you day to day, they get a real conversation, honestly held. Everyone else, quietly, only gets your results, whenever those results are ready to be seen. Philosophy that stays purely theoretical is entertainment, nothing more. Philosophy that becomes daily practice is transformation. So here is how all of this actually looks when applied to a real week of your real life. Start with what the Stoics referred to as the discipline of assent, which is simply the small pause that exists between something happening to you and you reacting to it. Someone criticizes a decision you've made. Someone questions your pace or your timeline. Someone implies, directly or indirectly, that you should be further along by now than you currently are. In that half-second pause before you respond, ask yourself one simple, clarifying question: does this particular person's opinion actually hold any real power over my eventual outcome? Not their feelings about your outcome. Their genuine, practical power over it. 9 times out of 10, the honest answer is no. They have an opinion. They do not have a real stake in the result. And the instant you separate opinion from actual stake, the emotional charge behind their words tends to collapse almost immediately, because you're no longer treating a stranger's passing comment as though it were a final verdict on your entire life. Next comes something worth practicing deliberately, which could be called selective invisibility. This does not mean secrecy purely for its own sake, or hiding things out of shame. It means being intentional about which parts of your journey get shared in real time, and which parts stay protected while they're still forming and fragile. A seed does not grow any faster because you keep digging it up every few days just to check on its progress. In fact, that habit is exactly how you end up killing it before it ever has the chance to root properly. Your goals, your healing process, your new discipline, they need that same kind of protection while they're young. Let them root fully before you expose them to the noise and weather of other people's opinions. Consider how this plays out inside a family, because family is usually where the pull to explain yourself is strongest and hardest to resist. You make a decision to leave a stable job for something riskier, to end a relationship that looked fine from the outside, to move somewhere no one expected. Almost immediately, the questions start. Why would you do that? Have you thought this through? What does everyone else think about it? Underneath most of those questions is not genuine curiosity. It is discomfort, because your decision has quietly reminded someone else of a choice they never made, a risk they never took, a version of themselves they buried a long time ago. Your silence, in that moment, isn't rudeness. It's mercy, both for you and for them, because a defensive explanation rarely changes anyone's mind. It usually just prolongs an argument that was never really about you in the first place. The same pattern shows up at work, in a slightly different costume. You stop volunteering updates on projects that aren't finished yet. You stop pre-explaining why a deadline might shift before it actually does. You let your output, not your commentary, carry the weight of your reputation. This unsettles people who are used to constant narration, because they've been trained by a culture of status updates to expect a play-by-play of everyone's effort. But the people who actually make decisions about your future rarely remember the updates. They remember the finished work. Somewhere along the way, many capable people confused being visible with being valuable, and started spending real hours managing perception instead of producing anything perception could actually be built on. There's a physical layer to all of this too, one that rarely gets mentioned in conversations about mindset. Constantly monitoring how you're perceived is not just a mental habit. It is a low-grade, continuous activation of your stress response, running quietly in the background of your day. Your body doesn't fully distinguish between an actual threat and the anxious anticipation of judgment. Both keep your system slightly elevated, slightly braced, slightly unable to fully rest. People who successfully practice minding their own business often report, almost as a side effect, that they simply sleep better. Not because their circumstances changed overnight, but because their nervous system finally got permission to stand down from a threat that was never as real as it felt. It's worth naming the specific fear that usually sits underneath the resistance to all of this, because naming it tends to shrink it. The fear is usually some version of, if I stop explaining myself, people will assume the worst, and I won't be there to correct it. But notice the assumption buried inside that fear, that other people's assumptions about you are powerful enough to shape your actual life. In almost every case, they aren't. Your landlord doesn't check your explanations before renewing your lease. Your bank doesn't need your narrative to process your payments. Your body doesn't require anyone's approval to keep healing from what you've been through. The explanation you feel so compelled to give is very often serving your own anxiety far more than it is serving any practical outcome in your life. There is also a quieter form of strength in simply letting people be wrong about you for a while. Someone will assume you've given up when you've actually just gone strategic. Someone will assume you're struggling when you're actually rebuilding on your own terms. The old instinct is to correct them immediately, to protect your image in real time. The Stoic instinct is different. It says, let the misunderstanding stand, because it costs you nothing real, and correcting it would cost you time, energy, and exposure you don't actually need to give away. Your results, delivered later, will correct the record far more convincingly than any explanation you could offer now. Think for a moment about how comparison actually works in a mind that's constantly connected. You open a screen for 30 seconds and, without meaning to, you've measured your unfinished life against someone else's carefully selected highlight. Their new house against your rented apartment. Their vacation against your quiet weekend. Their announced promotion against your still private effort. None of this is presented as a comparison, but your mind performs one anyway, instantly and mostly outside your awareness. The Stoics never had to deal with the feed, but they understood the underlying mechanism perfectly. Envy, Seneca wrote in his own way, is a tax the mind pays for looking too often at what belongs to someone else instead of tending to what is actually yours. The modern version of that tax is simply collected more efficiently, dozens of times a day, one scroll at a time. Here is a short scenario worth sitting with, because it's likely closer to your own life than it first appears. Picture two people starting the same goal on the same day, building a small business, getting back into shape, learning a difficult new skill. The first person tells everyone. Family, friends, and online audience. Every small step gets narrated, every win gets celebrated publicly, every setback gets explained away in a comment or a caption. The second person tells almost no one. They simply start, quietly, adjusting as they go, keeping their own private log of progress that nobody else will read for months, if ever. 6 months later, something predictable tends to happen. The first person has received a great deal of encouragement, but their actual progress is inconsistent, because a portion of their motivation kept leaking out through the applause along the way, and every setback had to be publicly managed instead of privately absorbed and corrected. The second person has received almost no attention at all, but their progress is steady, because every ounce of their energy went directly into the work rather than into managing how the work was perceived. This is not a rule that applies to everyone in every situation, but it is a pattern reliable enough that it's worth taking seriously before you decide how loudly to announce your own next chapter. There's one more piece worth addressing directly, because it tends to surface as soon as someone tries to apply any of this. What do you actually do with criticism that might be fair? Not every negative comment is noise to be filtered out. Some of it, uncomfortable as it is, contains something true and useful. The discipline here isn't to reject all outside input. It's to separate the message from the messenger's right to deliver it uninvited. A piece of feedback can be worth considering on its own merits, evaluated honestly against your own judgment, without you owing the person who gave it an explanation, a defense, or even a response at all. You can quietly take what's useful and discard the rest, without turning the exchange into a debate you never agreed to have. This is, in the end, the entire discipline in miniature. Not the suppression of thought or feeling. Not indifference toward the people who matter. Simply a clear, practiced line between what deserves your energy and what doesn't, redrawn a little more precisely every time you choose silence over explanation, and privacy over performance. There's also a kind of rest that only becomes available once you stop treating every interaction as something that needs to be managed. Picture the difference between 2 evenings. In the first, you scroll back through a conversation from earlier in the day, rehearsing better comebacks, wondering if you sounded defensive, drafting explanations in your head for people who probably forgot the exchange within minutes. In the second, the conversation simply ends when it ends. You said what needed saying to the people who deserved it, and everyone else's opinion is allowed to exist without your supervision. The second evening is not colder than the first. It is simply lighter, because you've stopped carrying weight that was never yours to carry in the first place. None of this happens overnight, and it shouldn't be expected to. The discipline of staying quiet while you build, of letting results speak instead of announcements, of treating your own judgment as sufficient even when no one else has confirmed it yet, is exactly that, a discipline, practiced imperfectly, refined slowly, strengthened one deliberate choice at a time. Some days you'll catch yourself explaining something you didn't need to explain, defending a decision nobody was actually attacking, seeking a kind of approval you no longer technically need. That's not failure. That's simply what practicing something difficult looks like before it becomes second nature. There's a subtle test worth running on yourself to see how deeply external validation has taken root, and it's simple enough to try right now. Think of something you're genuinely proud of that no one else knows about, a private habit you've kept, a boundary you held quietly, a piece of work you improved without telling anyone. Notice how that pride feels compared to the pride that arrives after public praise. If the private version feels thinner, less convincing, almost like it doesn't fully count until someone else confirms it, that's a clear sign of how much of your self-worth has been quietly outsourced over the years. This isn't a flaw unique to you. It's the default setting for most people raised in a world that rewards visible performance. But noticing it is the first real step toward changing it, because you cannot rebuild a foundation you haven't first identified as unstable. The good news, if there is a single piece of good news buried inside all of this, is that the muscle required to reverse this pattern responds quickly to practice, faster than most people expect. The first time you complete something meaningful and choose not to announce it, the discomfort is sharp. The 10th time, it's noticeably softer. By the 50th time, something genuinely shifts. Private accomplishment starts to feel sufficient on its own terms, not because you've suppressed the desire for recognition, but because you've built an internal source of it strong enough to no longer depend entirely on an external one. One more distinction is worth drawing clearly before moving forward, because it prevents this entire practice from tipping into something colder than it's meant to be. There's a difference between a stranger's fleeting opinion and a stakeholder's informed concern, and the two get treated identically far too often. A stranger's opinion costs you nothing to release, because it was formed instantly, without context, and will be forgotten just as quickly. A stakeholder's concern, someone who actually shares consequences with you, who has watched your situation closely, who is raising a point out of genuine care rather than casual judgment, deserves a different kind of attention entirely. The discipline being described here was never meant to flatten every voice into background noise. It was meant to sort the voices accurately, so that the rare, valuable ones don't get lost in the much larger crowd of ones that never needed a response in the first place. This is where the deeper part of this idea starts to open up, the part about why silence isn't just protective, but genuinely strategic, and what happens to a person once they finally stop needing an audience at all. That's exactly where the next part picks up. Picking straight back up from where the last part left off, the idea so far is simple to state, but genuinely rare to actually live out consistently. Your energy is finite, other people's opinions were never within your control to begin with, and every single hour spent explaining yourself to people who have no real stake in your life is an hour permanently stolen from your own becoming. Now it's time to go a layer deeper, into why silence is not merely protective, but genuinely strategic in a way most people never fully realize. Seneca, writing letters to a close friend nearly 2,000 years ago, warned about something he described as the danger of mixing too freely with a crowd. His concern was never really about being social in general. It was about something subtler and more damaging, the way that constantly explaining, justifying, and performing yourself in front of others slowly reshapes your own internal values to match theirs, without you ever consciously noticing the shift while it's happening to you. Here is how this plays out in an ordinary modern week. You start a genuinely new habit, waking up earlier, cutting out a distraction that's been draining you, committing fully to a long-term goal that matters to you. At first, your standards for that habit are entirely your own, clean and untouched by outside opinion. But the moment you start narrating that new habit out loud to people who don't share your standards or your priorities, something subtle begins to shift underneath the surface. You start explaining your own goal in terms that will earn their approval instead of terms that are actually true for you. You start quietly softening the parts of it that make them uncomfortable or skeptical. Slowly, almost invisibly, your own goal gets renegotiated by an audience that never had to live a single day of your actual life. This is precisely why so many people who are surrounded by constant feedback from every direction end up feeling more confused about their own direction than people who simply stayed quiet and did the work without narrating it. This isn't because feedback itself is bad. Feedback from the right person, at the right moment, given by someone who genuinely understands your situation, can be priceless and worth actively seeking out. But feedback from everyone, about everything, all the time, doesn't sharpen your direction the way people assume it will. It erodes it slowly, one well-meaning comment at a time, until you can no longer tell which parts of your plan are actually yours. The Stoic response to this danger was never full isolation from other people. It was careful, deliberate selectivity about who gets access to your unfinished thinking. Choose a small number of people whose judgment you genuinely trust, whose own lives you actually respect and want to learn from, and give only them real access to your process while it's still forming. Let everyone else simply witness the finished results later, if they ever get to see them at all. Here's something almost nobody says out loud clearly, but every serious builder eventually discovers it through hard experience. Silence is not only peaceful to live inside of. It is strategically superior to constant announcement in almost every practical way. When you explain your plans before you've actually executed any part of them, you give away 3 valuable things you can never fully get back. You give away the element of surprise, because your competitors, your critics, and your doubters now know exactly what you're attempting and can quietly position against it. You give away a piece of your own motivation, because talking about the plan releases a small hit of satisfaction that can partially replace the drive needed to actually finish it. And you give away your flexibility, because once you've publicly committed to one version of the plan, changing course later starts to feel like admitting failure, even in moments when adjusting course is actually the smartest possible decision. Compare that to the person who says almost nothing while they work. They test quietly. They fail privately, where failure is cheap and reversible. They adjust without an audience watching and judging every misstep along the way. By the time they finally do speak about it, they're not asking anyone for permission or approval. They are simply presenting a finished result. And a result is something people can no longer easily argue with. Opinions can attack an unfinished plan quite effectively. They struggle to attack a completed outcome nearly as well. This is not about secrecy for the sake of ego, or hiding things because of shame. It is about protecting the fragile, early stages of anything genuinely worth building: a business idea, a physical transformation, a repaired relationship with yourself, from the noise of people who have not yet earned the right to weigh in on it. There's an irony worth naming clearly here, because it matters. The people who struggle most with minding their own business are often not selfish, attention-seeking people at all. Quite the opposite. They are usually the most conscientious people in the room. They care deeply about being understood fairly, about being seen as good, about not being misjudged. So when someone misreads their intentions, the instinct to correct the record immediately can feel like a moral obligation rather than a choice. But consider this honestly for a moment: you will never be able to correct every misunderstanding that exists about you. Even Marcus Aurelius, ruling with near total authority over an empire, still faced criticism, rumor, and misinterpretation constantly throughout his reign, and he never had the time, energy, or ability to correct all of it personally. If the most powerful man in the ancient world could not manage everyone's perception of him, that particular project was never realistic for any of us either, no matter how hard we try. The relief in accepting that is genuinely enormous once it actually lands and settles in. You are not failing at managing your reputation. Reputation management, in the sense of controlling exactly what every single person thinks of you at all times, was never actually achievable for anyone, at any point in human history, no matter how much power, charm, or effort they had access to. What is achievable, every single day, is living in a way you personally respect, whether or not it is correctly understood by everyone else in real time. That shift, from trying to be perfectly perceived, to simply being consistently yourself, is the entire game. There's a particular kind of relationship worth examining closely here, because it's where this whole idea gets tested the hardest: the relationship with someone who consistently needs you to justify yourself before they'll offer any support. Maybe it's a parent who only engages with your choices through interrogation. Maybe it's a friend who treats every update about your life as an invitation to list reasons it might not work. The instinct is to keep trying, to eventually find the right explanation, the right amount of detail, the right tone that will finally earn their approval. But some people were never going to be satisfied by an explanation, no matter how well it was delivered, because their resistance was never actually about the quality of your reasoning. It was about their own discomfort with change, or their own unresolved relationship with risk, or a version of you they preferred that no longer exists. Recognizing this doesn't mean writing someone off entirely. It means adjusting what you expect from the exchange. You can love someone and still stop auditioning your decisions in front of them. You can stay close to someone and still decide that their approval is no longer a prerequisite for moving forward. This is one of the quieter, less discussed applications of Stoic thought, not just managing strangers and critics, but managing the much harder case of people you actually care about, whose opinions carry real emotional weight, but not actual authority over your life. There's a version of this same dynamic that shows up at work, usually disguised as collaboration. In many modern workplaces, there's an unspoken expectation that visible effort matters as much as actual output, that you should be seen working hard, seen staying late, seen responding quickly, seen participating in every conversation about a project even when your input isn't strictly needed. This creates a strange incentive where people start performing productivity instead of simply producing, because the performance is what gets noticed in the moment, while the actual results take longer to become visible. The quiet discipline here is choosing to opt out of the performance layer entirely. Do the work well. Communicate what genuinely needs to be communicated. Let the rest of your hours go toward the actual task instead of toward managing how busy you appear to be. It feels risky at first, because it goes against a culture that rewards visibility. But over enough time, the people who consistently deliver quietly tend to outlast the people who consistently perform loudly, because output, unlike performance, doesn't require ongoing maintenance to remain convincing. There's a related idea here worth sitting with, something the Stoics circled constantly without ever framing it quite the way we might today: the concept of delayed gratification, and how thoroughly modern life has eroded most people's capacity for it. Every platform you interact with is built to reward you immediately: a like within seconds, a comment within minutes, a notification that confirms someone noticed you. This trains a very specific expectation into the nervous system. Effort should produce visible feedback quickly, or it doesn't feel worth continuing. But almost everything actually worth building in a life, a body that's genuinely strong, a skill that's genuinely rare, a business that's genuinely stable, a sense of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, takes far longer to show results than any platform is designed to reward. Growing in silence is, in a very real sense, a form of rebuilding your own tolerance for delay, retraining yourself to keep working in the absence of immediate proof that it's working. Consider a short scenario that plays out constantly, in slightly different forms, across almost every industry and every stage of life. Two colleagues start at the same company on the same day, with similar skills and similar potential. One spends a significant portion of their energy managing how their work is perceived, flagging their own contributions in meetings, making sure credit is properly attributed, responding quickly and visibly to every message to appear engaged. The other spends that same energy simply doing the work at a slightly higher standard, saying less about it, letting their output accumulate quietly over time. In the short term, the first colleague often appears more impressive, because visibility reads as competence to people who are only paying partial attention. Over a longer period, though, the second colleague's actual body of work tends to become undeniable in a way that no amount of visible effort can fully replicate, because consistency, compounded quietly over time, produces a kind of evidence that talk simply cannot manufacture. Let's get specific about what growing in silence actually looks like across an ordinary week, because abstract philosophy without real application is simply a nice video you forget about by Thursday. It looks like waking up and doing the actual work before you tell anyone your plans for the day. It looks like receiving criticism from someone who has never built anything meaningful themselves, and simply not responding to it, not because you're weak or avoidant, but because their opinion carries no real operational weight in your life whatsoever. It looks like allowing a family member to misunderstand your career choice for another 6 months, because their approval was never actually a requirement for your success, only something that would have been comfortable to have along the way. It looks like stepping back from anything that quietly turns your healing into a performance, your discipline into content for strangers, your quiet mornings into something that needs to be proven to an audience before it's allowed to count as real. It looks like trusting that the version of you currently building without an audience is not behind schedule. That version is simply early, still in the stage of life where roots matter far more than visible leaves. And it looks like finally understanding that the two ideas in this video's title were never actually separate instructions. They are one single instruction. You mind your own business precisely so that you can grow in silence. And you grow in silence precisely because you've finally stopped handing your limited attention over to people who were never going to use it responsibly in the first place. There's a specific moment that tends to arrive for people who genuinely live this out, and it's worth naming clearly so you recognize it when it eventually happens to you. It's the moment when someone who used to have real power over your mood, a critic, a doubter, a person whose opinion used to ruin your entire day with a single comment, says something dismissive about you, and you notice, almost with quiet surprise, that it simply doesn't land the way it used to anymore. Not because you became harder or colder as a person. Because you became quieter on the inside, and that inner quiet left no open space for their noise to actually take hold and settle. That is not indifference toward life or the people in it. That is mastery, earned slowly. And it is available to you the exact same way it was available to a Roman emperor centuries ago, writing quietly in a journal by candlelight, reminding himself of the same simple truth night after night. Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Simply be one, and let that be the entire argument. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from being talked about inaccurately, and it deserves honest acknowledgement rather than a quick dismissal, because pretending it doesn't sting would be its own kind of dishonesty. Hearing that someone has told a version of your story that isn't true, watching a rumor spread faster than any correction could travel, feeling misjudged by people whose opinion you once valued, all of this is genuinely uncomfortable, and the discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's simply the cost of being a person who exists in relation to other people, all of whom are interpreting you through their own limited view, their own history, their own biases. The Stoic response was never to become numb to this discomfort. It was to notice it honestly, let it pass through without building a campaign around correcting it, and return attention to the parts of life that were still fully within reach. There's a useful distinction worth making here between reputation and character, because the two get confused constantly, and the confusion is where most of the suffering actually lives. Reputation is what other people believe about you, built out of partial information, second-hand stories, and their own projections. Character is what you actually do when no one is checking. These two things can diverge wildly, in both directions. A person with an excellent reputation can have very little actual character behind it, sustained entirely by good public relations and careful timing. A person with a damaged reputation, unfairly earned, can have exceptional character, quietly intact, regardless of what anyone believes about them. The Stoics placed almost all of their attention on character, treating reputation as something pleasant when accurate but ultimately unreliable, since it was never within direct control to begin with. This doesn't mean reputation is worthless. It means it was never supposed to be the foundation anything else was built on. Something else worth naming honestly, minding your own business will, at some point, cost you a relationship or two, and that's worth preparing for rather than being surprised by. Some people are only comfortable around a version of you that explains itself constantly, that seeks their approval before moving forward, that stays small enough not to threaten their own sense of place in your life. When that version of you stops showing up, some of those relationships will quietly fade, not because you did anything wrong, but because the dynamic that held them together depended on a version of you that no longer exists. This is not something to fear. It is, in most cases, simply the natural filtering that happens when you stop performing for an audience that was never actually invested in your growth to begin with. What remains afterward tends to be smaller, but far more genuine. There is a particular kind of trust that has to be rebuilt with yourself before any of this becomes sustainable, and it's worth being honest about how that trust erodes in the first place. Every time you seek external validation instead of trusting your own read on a situation, you send yourself a quiet message: my own judgment isn't quite enough on its own. Repeated enough times over enough years, that message becomes a belief, and the belief becomes a habit of constantly checking outside yourself before you're willing to act. Rebuilding that trust doesn't happen through a single dramatic decision. It happens through small, repeated evidence, making a call without asking for outside approval first, and watching it turn out fine. Sitting with a decision privately for a while before speaking about it, and noticing that the sky doesn't fall. Each of these small moments deposits a little more evidence into an account that was allowed to run empty for a long time, and eventually that account becomes strong enough to draw on with real confidence. Money tends to bring this entire discussion into especially sharp focus, because few topics invite unsolicited opinions faster than how someone else chooses to earn, save, or spend. Tell people you're being cautious with spending this year, and someone will suggest you're being paranoid. Tell people you're taking a financial risk, and someone else will suggest you're being reckless. There is functionally no version of a financial decision that will escape commentary from someone who isn't actually managing the consequences of it. The quiet approach here isn't secrecy out of shame. It's simply recognizing that financial decisions are almost always made with information the commentator doesn't have access to: your actual expenses, your actual goals, your actual risk tolerance, built from your own life rather than theirs. Letting the results speak, later, tends to end these conversations far more effectively than any explanation offered in the moment ever could. There's a broader pattern worth naming across all of this, one that ties directly back to the deeper Stoic idea of living according to nature rather than according to expectation. Comparison, at its root, asked you to measure your life against a path you didn't choose, built by circumstances you didn't experience, judged by a timeline that was never actually yours. Someone else's faster progress doesn't erase your own. Someone else's different choices don't invalidate yours. The moment you stop treating other people's lives as the measuring stick for your own, an enormous amount of unnecessary suffering simply stops arriving in the first place, not because you fixed anything about your circumstances, but because you stopped applying the wrong ruler to them. Quiet consistency, more than any single dramatic decision, is what actually produces the kind of life this entire discussion has been circling. Not one big, well-explained pivot that gets applause for a week and then fades from memory. Rather, hundreds of small, unannounced choices, showing up to the work again on an ordinary Tuesday when no one is watching, holding a boundary in a conversation that would have been easier to abandon, letting a misunderstanding stand instead of chasing it down, repeated often enough that they stop being choices at all and simply become who you are. That accumulation, invisible in any single moment, is the entire mechanism behind everything this video has been describing. Timing deserves a mention here too, because part of what makes quiet growth so effective is that it protects the most vulnerable stage of anything new, the beginning, when a plan is still fragile, still full of unknowns, still liable to be talked out of existence by a single well-placed doubt from someone whose opinion you gave too much weight to. Ideas and habits are strongest once they've survived their own early uncertainty in private, tested against reality rather than against other people's immediate reactions. By the time you're ready to speak about something openly, it has usually already proven itself durable enough to withstand whatever response it receives, which is precisely why it no longer needs anyone's early approval to keep existing. There's a risk worth naming honestly before this discussion moves any further, because quiet confidence and arrogance can start to look similar from the outside if this practice isn't grounded carefully. The goal was never to stop caring what's true about your own work, only to stop outsourcing the judgment of what's true to people unqualified to make that call. A person practicing this well still welcomes real correction from people who genuinely know better, still stays honest with themselves about where their effort has actually fallen short, still remains humble enough to keep learning. What changes is not the willingness to grow. What changes is who gets to define whether that growth is happening, no longer a crowd of casual observers, but your own honest assessment, checked occasionally against the small number of people whose judgment has actually earned a seat at that table. The next part goes further still, into what happens once this practice becomes second nature, how it changes the way you handle conflict for good, and the one final mental shift that separates people who quietly build something lasting from people who quietly burn out chasing approval that was never coming anyway. By now the shape of this idea should be clear. Your energy is limited, other people's opinions were never yours to control, and every hour spent explaining yourself to people without a real stake in your life is an hour taken away from the only project that actually matters, your own becoming. What's left is the hardest part, and also the most useful part: what happens when this stops being a video you watched, and starts being how you actually move through conflict, criticism, and disappointment for the rest of your life. Start with conflict, because this is where most people lose the practice the fastest. It is one thing to stay quiet about a goal. It is another thing entirely to stay composed when someone is standing in front of you, actively trying to provoke a reaction. The old Stoics had a specific way of thinking about this that still holds up completely today. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that the best revenge is to not become like the person who wronged you. Not to win the argument. Not to prove them wrong in front of witnesses. Simply to not let their behavior pull you down to their level of reaction. This is harder than it sounds, because provocation is designed to work. Someone who wants a reaction from you is usually offering you a very tempting trade: give me 5 minutes of your composure, and I'll give you the temporary satisfaction of feeling like you won. Almost every time, that trade is a terrible one. The 5 minutes of composure you hand over rarely comes back cheaply. It shows up later as a ruined mood, a sleepless night replaying the exchange, a version of you that spent real energy on someone who will have forgotten the entire conversation by tomorrow. The alternative the Stoics practiced was not suppression. It was not swallowing anger and pretending it doesn't exist, because that approach tends to build pressure that leaks out somewhere else, usually onto people who didn't deserve it. The alternative was a genuine, practiced pause, long enough to ask one question before responding: will reacting here actually change the outcome, or will it simply make me feel temporarily powerful while costing me something real? Most of the time, staying quiet costs you nothing except the fleeting satisfaction of a comeback. Reacting costs you your composure, your reputation with people who are actually watching how you handle pressure, and sometimes the relationship itself. There's a modern layer to this worth naming honestly, because conflict today often doesn't happen face to face anymore. It happens in messages, in comment sections, in group chats where tone is easy to misread and reactions spread faster than clarity ever can. This makes the old discipline even more valuable, not less. A message can sit unanswered for an hour while you decide whether it deserves your energy at all. A comment can simply not be replied to. The silence that used to require real physical restraint now sometimes only requires you to put the phone down for 20 minutes, which is a far smaller ask than what the ancient Stoics were working with, and yet most people still can't manage it. Now consider disappointment, because this is the second place where the practice tends to break down. Not disappointment in other people. Disappointment in yourself, when growth doesn't happen as fast as you expected, when the quiet work you've been doing hasn't produced the results you were hoping for yet. This is exactly the moment when the old pull toward external validation comes back strongest, because a part of you starts to wonder if maybe you should have been louder about the effort after all, just so someone could tell you it's going to be okay. Here's the reframe that actually holds up under pressure. The Stoics didn't measure a good life by outcomes, because outcomes are only partially within anyone's control. They measured it by effort and character, because those two things are fully within your control regardless of what the results look like on any given day. This isn't a comforting slogan meant to make failure feel nice. It's a genuinely different operating system for judging your own life. If you showed up, did the work with integrity, and responded to setbacks without abandoning your standards, you succeeded by the only measure that was ever actually within your control. The outcome will follow its own timeline, influenced by 1,000 factors you can't fully see or manage. This is where growing in silence becomes less about protecting your image and more about protecting your relationship with yourself. When nobody is watching your effort, the only person you have to answer to is you. There's no audience to perform resilience for. There's no comment section to convince that you're handling it well. It's just you, alone with the actual truth of your own effort, and that truth becomes the only scoreboard that matters. People who get comfortable with that kind of solitary accountability tend to develop a form of confidence that doesn't wobble every time someone questions them, because their sense of worth was never built on being seen in the first place. There's also a longer-term shift worth naming, because it explains why this entire practice compounds over time instead of just providing temporary relief. Every time you choose not to explain yourself to someone who doesn't deserve an explanation, every time you let a misunderstanding stand rather than chasing it down to correct it, every time you keep a goal private until it's ready to speak for itself, you are training a specific mental muscle. That muscle is emotional independence, the ability to remain steady regardless of what other people think, say, or assume about you. Like any muscle, it gets stronger with repetition and weaker with neglect. The first few times you practice this, it will feel unnatural, almost uncomfortable, like you're doing something wrong by not defending yourself. Over months, that discomfort fades, and what replaces it is something closer to genuine peace, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances lining up perfectly. This is also where quiet growth becomes something close to a competitive advantage in ordinary daily life, not just in business or career terms. People who are constantly explaining themselves are, in a very real sense, giving away their energy in small amounts all day long, to dozens of people, most of whom will never remember the exchange by the next morning. People who have learned to keep that energy contained tend to have far more of it left over at the end of the day, for the things and the people that actually deserve it, their own goals, their closest relationships, their rest. Over a year, that difference in energy expenditure adds up to something significant, even though no single moment of it looks dramatic on its own. None of this means becoming unreachable or pretending to be unaffected by everything. The goal was never to stop feeling things. It was to stop handing your feelings over to people who have no genuine investment in your life. There is a real difference between a person who has gone numb and a person who has simply become selective about where their emotional energy goes. The first is a defense mechanism built out of exhaustion. The second is a discipline, built deliberately, one small choice at a time, the same way Marcus Aurelius built his through nightly journal entries nobody else was ever meant to read. There's a deeper layer underneath all of this worth addressing directly, because it explains why this practice feels so difficult for genuinely good, capable people specifically. Somewhere along the way, many people quietly attached their sense of identity to being understood correctly by everyone around them. Being misjudged didn't just feel unpleasant. It felt like a threat to who they actually were, as if an inaccurate story told by someone else could somehow overwrite the truth of their own life. This is worth examining honestly, because it's rarely true in practice. A rumor doesn't change what you actually did. A misunderstanding doesn't rewrite your actual character. The gap between how you're perceived and who you actually are can feel unbearable in the moment, but it has almost no power over the actual facts of your life, unless you hand it that power by treating other people's inaccurate version of you as more real than your own lived experience of yourself. Relationships deserve one more honest pass here, because this entire discipline can easily be misapplied in ways that damage the people closest to you if it isn't handled with care. There is a meaningful difference between not explaining yourself to people who have no stake in your life, and going silent with someone who has earned honesty from you and is left confused by your sudden distance. A partner deserves to know what's happening in your inner world, even during a season where you're intentionally pulling back from everyone else. A close friend deserves the truth, even a difficult one, rather than a vague silence that leaves them guessing at what they did wrong. The strength being described throughout this video was never meant to be used as a wall against the people who actually love you. It was meant to be a filter against the noise of people who don't, so that what's left over, your attention, your openness, your willingness to be known, can be given fully to the few relationships that have actually earned it. There is also something worth saying about legacy, because it eventually enters this conversation whether directly addressed or not. Many people assume that a quiet life, one lived without constant explanation or public narration, must also be a life that leaves less behind. The opposite tends to be true. A life spent managing perception produces, at best, a well-managed perception, something that fades quickly once the person managing it is no longer present to maintain it. A life spent on quiet, consistent effort produces something with actual substance behind it, work that holds up on its own, relationships built on real trust rather than performance, a character that doesn't require ongoing explanation because it was never built on explanation in the first place. Marcus Aurelius never wrote his journal thinking it would outlast the empire he ruled by close to 2,000 years. He wrote it because the discipline itself mattered to him, privately, regardless of whether anyone would ever witness it. That is very often how the most lasting things get built, not for an audience, but in spite of not having one. It's worth returning, one more time, to the specific discomfort of the early stages of this practice, because it's the single biggest reason most people abandon it before it has a chance to work. In the beginning, going quiet feels like losing something, losing the comfort of reassurance, losing the quick relief of being understood immediately, losing the social rhythm of constant back-and-forth validation that most relationships and most platforms are built around. This loss is real, and pretending it isn't would be dishonest. But it is a short-term loss in exchange for something far more durable, a version of you that no longer needs the world's constant agreement in order to keep moving forward. That trade, uncomfortable as it is at first, is very often the actual price of becoming someone capable of building anything that lasts. There's a practical version of all this worth walking through, because it can be tempting to leave a video like this feeling inspired without actually changing a single habit by tomorrow morning. Picture how a single ordinary day might look if this discipline were actually applied from the moment you woke up. You wake up and, instead of reaching immediately for a screen full of other people's updates, you give yourself even 10 quiet minutes that belong to no one else's opinion, no comparison, no feed, no borrowed emotional weather from a stranger's morning. You move through your first real task of the day without narrating it to anyone, simply doing it because it needs to be done, letting the completion of it be its own quiet reward rather than something that needs an audience to feel finished. When a comment arrives later in the day, whether from a coworker, a family member, or a stranger online, that doesn't sit right with you, you pause before responding, running the same simple question from earlier: does this person's opinion actually hold power over my outcome? And you let that question do the work of deciding whether a response is even necessary at all. By the evening, something subtle but noticeable has usually happened. You haven't spent the day managing anyone's perception of you. You've spent it building, however slightly, towards something that actually matters to you. That difference, repeated across weeks and months, is what eventually produces a life that looks nothing like the anxious, reactive, constantly explaining version that so many people accept as normal simply because it's familiar. There's a longer view worth taking here too, one that becomes clearer with age but is worth understanding early rather than learning it the hard way later. Almost everyone who has lived long enough to look back honestly on their own life reports some version of the same regret. They spent too much time worrying about people whose opinions turned out not to matter, and not enough time on the handful of relationships and pursuits that actually did. This isn't speculation. It shows up consistently in research on end-of-life reflection, and it echoes almost exactly what Seneca warned about in his own writing on the shortness of life, that people are careful with their money and careless with their time, guarding their possessions closely while handing their actual hours over to anyone who asks for them. The specific ask, in the modern version of this problem, is rarely for your money. It's for your explanation, your justification, your constant availability to manage what other people think of you. Recognizing that pattern now, rather than decades from now, is the entire value of taking this seriously today instead of treating it as a nice idea to revisit someday. There's also a form of gratitude buried inside this discipline that's easy to miss, because the whole conversation can start to sound purely defensive, protecting your energy, guarding your time, filtering out noise. But there's a positive side to it as well. When you stop spending your attention on people who don't deserve it, you free up an enormous amount of it for the people and pursuits that genuinely do. The friend who actually shows up gets more of you, not less. The work that actually matters gets your full focus instead of a fraction of it, diluted by everything else competing for your attention. The version of yourself you're quietly building gets the resources it actually needs to become real, instead of those resources being spent managing a story for people who are only ever passing through your life. It's worth being honest, too, about what this practice will not do. It will not make every person like you. It will not stop every rumor, resolve every misunderstanding, or guarantee that the people who matter most will always understand your choices in real time. Nothing can promise that, and any philosophy that claims otherwise is selling something rather than teaching something. What this practice actually offers is narrower, and more honest, a way to keep your energy, your peace, and your direction intact regardless of whether understanding ever arrives. That's a smaller promise than most self-improvement content makes, but it's one that actually holds up under real pressure, which is worth far more than a bigger promise that collapses the first time life gets difficult. It helps to think of this whole discipline less as a single decision and more as a habit that gets built the same way any other habit gets built, through small, repeated reps rather than one dramatic commitment made once and expected to last forever. Nobody builds physical strength by deciding once, with great enthusiasm, to be strong. They build it by showing up to the same unremarkable effort again and again, on days when it feels rewarding and on days when it doesn't, until the capacity is simply there, embedded, no longer requiring conscious effort to access. The discipline of minding your own business works the exact same way. The first few times you choose not to explain yourself, it will feel like a decision, effortful and deliberate. Eventually, it stops feeling like a decision at all. It simply becomes how you move through the world, the same way a trained response eventually replaces a conscious one in any skill practiced long enough. Consider, too, how this shift changes the way you handle other people's chaos, not just their opinions of you. Plenty of people move through life recruiting others into their own drama, their own outrage, their own urgent need for an audience to validate their version of events. Before this discipline takes hold, it's easy to get pulled into that current without noticing, offering opinions on situations that were never yours to weigh in on, taking sides in conflicts that don't actually involve you, absorbing stress that belongs to someone else's life rather than your own. Minding your own business cuts both ways. It's not only about protecting your own choices from other people's judgment. It's about declining the invitation to judge, referee, or manage situations that were never handed to you in the first place. That single boundary alone tends to free up a surprising amount of mental space once it's actually enforced consistently. There's a specific kind of clarity that becomes available once both directions of this discipline are working together, protecting your own life from unnecessary explanation, and declining to insert yourself into everyone else's. What's left, once both of those layers of noise are removed, is something close to what the Stoics were actually describing when they talked about a well-ordered mind. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, because life continues to offer plenty of both regardless of how disciplined you become. Simply the absence of unnecessary noise layered on top of that difficulty, noise you were never required to carry, added voluntarily, out of habits formed long before you had the tools to question them. It's worth pausing to acknowledge something honestly before closing this out. None of this is about becoming someone who no longer needs people. Human beings are not built for total self-sufficiency, and any philosophy that pushes too hard toward isolation eventually does more harm than good. The Stoics themselves maintained deep friendships, mentorships, and correspondences throughout their lives. What they were describing was never a life without connection. It was a life where connection is chosen deliberately, built with people who've earned real access to your inner world, rather than distributed indiscriminately to anyone who happens to be watching. There is a profound difference between solitude that isolates and solitude that clarifies, and the entire aim of this discipline has been the second kind, not the first. Think about what becomes possible once this way of moving through the world starts to feel natural rather than effortful. Decisions get made faster, because they no longer require a committee of outside opinions before they feel safe to act on. Setbacks get absorbed more cleanly, because they no longer come with the added weight of managing how the setback looks to everyone watching. Relationships get simpler, because the ones that remain are the ones that were never dependent on your constant explanation to survive in the first place. None of this arrives instantly. It arrives the way most real change arrives, slowly, then somewhat suddenly, once enough small repetitions have quietly accumulated into something that finally holds its own weight. If there's one final thing worth carrying out of this, it's this: you don't need permission to go quiet. You don't need to announce that you're changing, justify why you've pulled back from certain conversations, or explain why you're no longer defending yourself the way you used to. The people who matter will notice the change in your results eventually, without needing a speech first. The people who don't matter were never going to be satisfied by an explanation anyway, no matter how well you delivered it. Let your work speak in the meantime. Let your discipline speak. Let the quiet version of you keep building in the background, unbothered by whoever is watching or not watching, because the only opinion that was ever actually going to determine how your life turns out was your own, all along. If this series gave you something worth thinking about, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel is built around: old, tested wisdom, made useful for the life you're actually living right now. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thinking delivered regularly, and if there's someone in your life who needs permission to stop explaining themselves and start building quietly instead, send this to them. Let your results speak. Let your silence do the rest.